Hi, I'm Joel Wanasek. I'm a mixer and the co-founder of nailthemix.com. And today I want to talk about how to develop a signature sound that makes you stand out with your work from everybody else in the pack. Every single great mixer on the planet has this, and you know what I'm talking about. For example, if you take like CLA or Serban or Andy Wallace or, Ben Gross or Tom Lord Alge, they all have certain sound where you can hear a mix and you can be like, that's so-and-so, that's so-and-so, you can quickly identify it. And that is one of the things that people hire them for, is they have a certain signature sound that a lot of people think sounds great and that makes them stand out from the rest of the pack. So let's dive into some of these concepts here and talk all about this and get started. So the first thing before we can talk about exactly how to do this and some strategies you can employ is to understand the process of that by looking at the time horizon it takes to do so. Okay, so what does that mean? So in the beginning of mixing and when you're learning, it kind of looks like this. Usually you go out, you hear about people doing things, you might watch some videos online or something like that, you try things, you copy people's chains, you throw some things in and that's what you do. You like hear that, oh, this big mixer throws an 1176 on their vocals at these settings. Oh, cool, I'm gonna do that on mine. All right, cool, that sounds all right. Now that's my vocal chain. You know what I mean? So in the beginning, a lot of people, I feel like, start doing that in their career where basically they come in and they just grab people's settings or they hear about things. And for many, many years, they try things or they hear tricks they find online and they compile a bunch of stuff and they try to get things to work slowly but surely. Now, what happens over many more years of doing this and gaining experience is you start to build certain chains of your own as you come into a higher level of understanding. For example, it might take somebody 5 years of mixing to even be able to hear a compressor and the attack and release times and what they do and what ratio they may or may not want to use and how to use it, right? This stuff isn't easy. So, what's going to happen is over time, you're going to try a lot of different things. You're going to experiment and you're going to find things that become a go-to for you. For example, like you've got a certain vocal chain of things that sound pretty good that work most of the time. And of course, you're going to use different things on different artists and different situations, but you're going to know that like, hey, I like the 1176 or I like a LA2A style compressor, or, I like a hard limiter, like an L1 or something like that. And then, I'd like to use a multiband, or I like to use regular EQ, or I'd like to use this particular EQ, right? So you're going to find tools that are going to basically come into your workflow that are going to work in most situations, and they're going to become your go-tos. Because in mixing, what are we doing, right? We're not copying chains. Ultimately, we are solving problems in mixing. And what solving problems are is like you hear something, you're like, it sounds great, or it doesn't sound right. If it doesn't sound right, what do I need to do to fix it? Okay, now it sounds right. Cool. How does it sound against everything else? Do we need to make adjustments, right? So mixing is just basically a sequential solving of problems when you're doing things with audio, just hearing something and just identifying what needs to happen, right? So like I said, you're going to get a set of tools. Now, as you get more and more and more experience in the game and spend more and more years, now you get, let's just say over a decade into this, you're going to start creating habits that are really, really well entrenched in certain things. And you're going to come up with certain techniques that you really love. Like, for example, some person might like parallel drum compression for attack. Like they have a certain way they do it, a certain type of routing, a certain type of workflow, a certain type of like template for their routing, things like that. Basically a workflow and a style that just reinforces itself over and over and over and over and over again. And as you get even more and more and more experienced, you become kind of like a master painter where you're like, if somebody says, hey, I need this snare drum to sound like this. Okay, there's like 30 different ways you can do that. You can compress it, you can parallel compress it, you can saturate it, you can parallel saturate it, you can EQ it, you could combine this with that, try it, sample it. You could, there's so many different techniques that you can do. And a master is somebody who can just sit down and figure out, okay, I know 30 ways to do this. This is probably going to be the best one. Okay, that didn't work. Let's try that one. Let's try this one. Boom, that one works. Great. Got it to sound how I need it to sound. On to the next thing. So, a master is somebody who kind of just comes in and just totally dominates their skill set and just knows how to fix any problem very quickly and get something to sound great no matter what type of source material they've gotten. So again, this is a trajectory that a person will go through over, many, many, many years, 10, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, right? You're constantly evolving, constantly improving in your game, constantly trying new things. Now, at some point in that trajectory as a professional, you've spent enough time doing this where those decisions that you make, for example, what type of EQ moves you like to use, what type of compression ratios, how they accumulate across a system, how do you route things? Do you send your entire mix to a bus compressor? Do you send your instrumental mix to a bus compressor and take your vocal outside? Do you use multiple mix bus compressors spread across different instruments? Like, those things are going to start to create a signature sound. And as you do more and more work and become more and more popular in the mixing game and get more clientele and get bigger and bigger and bigger, that signature sound grows and gets stronger and reinforces itself. It's the way you hear, it's your lens, your interpretation on the world. So now that you understand the trajectory that most people go through and some of the different stages, let's talk about some ways to actually help you identify and strengthen your signature sound and develop it. The first thing that really helps people develop a signature sound, aside from, just practice and experience, is the types of tools that they are using, meaning the gear. Now, it doesn't have to be hardware, it can also be software, right? So when I say gear, I mean absolutely everything. Okay. So, if you use, there's 5, 6, 7 different types of SSL plugin channel strip on the market. They all pretty much, they might have the curves map, but they all sound just a little bit different. Try it sometime. Take 10 different stems, throw a bunch of EQ compression on it, and then throw the same settings on another one and print those mixes and compare. And you're going to hear subtle differences, right? They have a sonic signature. The format that you use has a sonic signature. For example, if you mix in the box, it has a sonic signature. If you mix on a console, it has a sonic signature, let alone a different console. If you mix on some crazy hybrid system with a bunch of things mishmashed together, that has a sonic signature. And if you mix on tape, neither less which tape machine or which tape setting or whatever, that has a sonic signature. And for the people out there who are going to flame me and say, the box is perfect, dude, because I've had this garbage thrown at me before. Mixing in the box doesn't have a sound. It's totally pristine and blah, blah, blah. Nah, mixing in a computer has a sound. Everything has a sound. We need to be able to agree on that to move forward here. Like, when you mix in a computer, it has a certain sound to it. There's a certain way the front to back sounds, the left to right sounds, the top to bottom. It has certain limitations. Just like if you move to an analog desk, it's got certain limitations with the top to bottom, the front to back, the left to right. Same thing with tape. These are different animals. These are different formats. They sound different, and it's important to acknowledge that. So the format that you choose is going to change your sonic signature. For example, I mixed hybrid for a long time. I mixed in the box for a long time. And then I went back after being in hybrid for a while to in the box for 5 years. And now I've switched to a large format analog console. And the reason is because it has a sonic signature and a workflow that I want. And my mixes on an SSL are much different sounding than my mixes in a computer. Even if I'm using the same type of processing change in the box and the same type of, bus processing and routing and the same type of workflow I've been using for years, it still sounds different because a desk imparts a sonic signature to your work. It makes some things easier. It makes some things harder. So the tools that you select when you're mixing are very, very, very important. And this is where differentiation, I think, is important as a mixer, because what I always do is I kind of look at what other people are doing and I say to myself, hey, how can I be different? So if everybody is using Soothe, for example, right now, and they're using a certain drum pack and a certain guitar thing and metal, and that's really, really popular, and let's just say a large part of the market of people that are making music are putting out things with those tools. Guess what? A lot of those things are going to have a certain similar sound. And even though the mixers in those different markets are going to come out with different results, everything is still going to have the same sonic signature because people are using the same tools. Now, if one person does those same tools but mixes through an analog SSL versus the other, let's just say 2,000 that are doing it in the box, guess what? That person's going to have a very different take and a very different signature on their mix. So I think it's important to take gear into consideration. One of the easiest ways to add a signature sound is to invest in some equipment or plugins that sound a certain way that give you a sound. And I've been doing this myself the last 2 years extensively, going through and testing every single thing like, hey, let's have this, and this unit for bass, so we can get all these different variety of bass tones, okay? And now let's try this preamp or this channel strip, and let's experiment. Let's find the best combination to our ears. That sounds like the best chain that we can come up with that gives us all of the flexibility and availability to adapt that sound to sound like whatever we're mixing, from hip hop to alt rock to death metal to anything in between, right? So my assistant and I have done this very tediously and gone through and picked the best equipment to our ears to figure out where we want to put it. I would recommend you maybe do this the same. Now, look, I'm not saying you need to go drop a bunch of cash and spend a lot of money on gear, but what I'm saying is if you have analog gear in your setup, every piece of gear sounds different, and it is going to impart its tone on your mix and give you something different that sounds sonically different than in the box. If you're mixing in the box, one of the hard parts of the limitation is most plugins sound the same. And I know that's going to get a lot of people in a tizzy, but it's a fact. Like I build plugins, I sell plugins. I know how these things are coded. I have a different level of understanding of this stuff than most people, because I sit down with programmers and we talk about this stuff and have very, very long conversations about the theoretical limitations and how much we actually don't understand about electricity yet, right? In terms of coding. So, most EQs sound the same to me in the box. What you're paying for when you buy an EQ plugin is mostly the workflow and the UI and the ease of use and, stuff like that. It's not necessarily the sonics, because if you go and you match out a bunch of curves, right, and a bunch of plugins, like say you have like 5 different SSL plugins, they're all going to have the same curve more or less. And, like the manufacturer might offset something according to a knob or change the curve. There might be little differentiations in the math and some of the digital saturation. But if you really take, like I said, all of the SSL channel strip plugins and mix 10 stems with them at the exact same settings and print it down and put it in the box like I have, you're going to find that there's a very, very, very small difference between them. Like they sound pretty much all the same. It's a little bit of a difference. It's a slight variance, but I'm telling you, if you do that now on a console, because I got 32 hardware ones sitting in front of me, and do the same settings, and I've done it before, and you go and compare that to that mix, it sounds pretty different. So, problem I have with a lot of digital tools is it's harder to differentiate things because there's, again, a sonic signature to it. Now, the hard part is if you want to go out of that sound, right, like I said, how can you do it for a good bang for the buck? Because not everybody can throw it on a console. It's not practical or feasible for most people. Like, you've got to be really well established and have a great workflow and a lot of clients to be able to do something like that. I understand that. I acknowledge it. I've gone through that stage of my life. It's taken me 20 years to figure out how to get something like this into my life. So there are ways to do it. For example, if we bought a lunchbox, right, and we bought 8 channels of EQ. If you bought all Mags, or you bought all Phoenix Audios, or you bought all Elysias, or you bought all, like Heritage 1073 style, or you bought all APIs, just run like your main stems through them. That's going to radically change the sonic signature of those mixes. Because, for example, an API sound, and I used to have an API console, is different than an SSL. Is it better? Is it worse? No, both are amazing tools, but they just sound different. Your ear might like, a Phoenix Audio EQ or a Mag EQ or an Elysia EQ. There are certain things that those tools do to audio that change the way that they fundamentally sound. So, for example, one way, like I said, that you could differentiate your sound is going through and coming up with combinations of equipment that allow you to get different tonal aspects and to bring things out. So those are some considerations. All right, so the next thing that you can do is adjust the decisions that you're making, especially when it comes to EQ and compression in your mixing. Okay, so for example, if you've ever watched somebody like CLA mix, you'll notice he loves 8K, he loves to crank the red band on his thing. It's a very, very common move. So if you're cranking 8K in all your EQ moves, guess what? That gives you a certain curve. But some people might like 10K, or some people might use a different, frequency for every single top boost they do or shelf, right? So the EQ decisions that you make, for example, do you have a mix bus EQ like I do? If you set it at 60 hertz on the bottom, say you have a Pultec, or 30 hertz or 35 or 50 or 60 or 100 or 200, right? And you do boosts and shelves and cuts, like you're going to come up with a different sonic characteristic for your mix that can help it stand out against the competition. Because, for example, if you have somebody that always mixes with a Pultec boost at, let's just say 70 on their bottom end by, 5 dB, and then they boost up on top by, let's just say 5K at 3 dB, like that EQ curve and tone of that unit is going to be applied to every single thing they do. It's their curve, it's their signature, it's part of their sound and the results that they're going to get. So, what you can do is you can sit around and say, hey, I know a lot of people are doing like 70 or 60, you know, maybe I'm going to do a boost at 30, or maybe I'm going to do a boost at 120. I don't know. Right. So, or maybe I'm not going to use a pull tech on my mix bus because too many people do it. And I'm not going to use an SSL bus compressor. Maybe I'll use an API 2500. So it's very important for you to think about things like that every decision that you make, every chain, every single thing you put on audio has a sound and an impact and affects the bigger picture. And those decisions, those choices, those EQ moves that you're doing, those frequencies that you constantly turn, that you keep going back to over and over and again, that is part of your sound. And if you want to change your sound or modify it, like maybe you don't like your top end, then you need to experiment with the equipment. I'll give you an example. So I was on an API console for a while. I was really liking the mids and the bottom end I was getting. There was something about my top end for about 6 months on my mixes that I just, you know, I get in my car and I'm just like, there's something I don't like about it. So I experimented a lot. I switched to an SSL. I changed some of the EQ moves I was doing and some of the frequencies that I boosted. Boom. Now I have a very different top end sound to my mixes where I had, you know, and I adjusted the low end sound, you know, and things like that. So again, if you sit down and you think about this stuff, you calculate it, you can kind of build a tone like Lego blocks. Again, this is not something that happens overnight. This is something that happens over a long time, but you can build a tone like Lego blocks that helps you position yourself against other people. The next way to establish your signature sound is to experiment a lot. Okay. And what I mean by this is like, I get it. When you're a pro and you're busy, like it can get to the point where you just work 6-7 days a week, sun up to sundown. And like, you can just do that for months and months and months, years, endless. It's endless. Like I've been in that grind myself. A lot of my friends that are killing big records are in that grind. You know, like you've probably been there at some point in your time. And if you haven't, and you work hard and you get good at this stuff, you will be. Okay. So when you're working, it's really easy to go back and fall back to what you know really well. And it's very hard to sit down and to take time to experiment. Experimentation is very important. So what I do in my life is I literally block out like an hour or two a week to just sit down and play with stuff and try to come up with new things, new approaches, and new ways of doing this. Now, a great way to do this obviously is mixing education. For example, going to somewhere like Nail the Mix and watching other people who are really, really good at this do what they do. Trying their chains out and thinking about how they're thinking and understanding why they're doing things, and then taking that and trying to apply something like, oh, this person approaches their drums like this. They use a lot of this with this. Boom, let's try an approach like that on mine. Okay, well, it doesn't really work for me. Or, oh, wow, that's really cool. But if I modify it like this, now I've got a cool twist on it. Okay, now that's something a little bit different, right? So getting inspired and then taking the time to take that knowledge and just, you know, those ideas and those concepts and to bring them into your studio and to just experiment is so critical. And this is something I didn't do for a long time because I was so busy working and mixing that, you know, you just kind of get burned out and you don't really want to experiment. Sometimes it's easy to get lazy and just stick in your rut. The problem is when you're stuck in your rut, you know, you can run into a position where you feel like you haven't gotten better in a year or two. And that's a really scary thing. You want to feel like you're constantly making quantum leaps. So what happens is if you get complacent and you're like, yeah, you know, I'm doing really good. I have a ton of work and, you know, people seem to like the work. So why change the formula, right? Well, you have to keep updating your sound because the markets change, the trends change. So the way to do that is to sit down and just to schedule time into your life to experiment, to constantly try new things and to bombard your brain with new ideas. And again, this is why I like to watch other people mix, talk about mixing, and consume so much mixing content. By the way, here's a pro hack at that. You can watch videos, watch them at 1.5 to 2x because you can sit there like when you're driving, you know, like listen to a podcast or something, or listen to somebody talk about mixing or have some philosophical, you know, debate on something. You can just watch it at like 1.75x and get through it twice as fast and, you know, retain the information. So that's a good pro tip right there. But anyways, learning as much information about it as possible, keeping your perspective fresh, and then spending time to actually experiment, try things, plug things in backwards, you know, put plugins and weird things, put plugins that aren't supposed to be on certain, you know, like for example, take a vocal plugin and throw it on your guitars, or take a guitar plugin and throw it on your vocals or your drums or your mix bus. Like, why not? That's where happy accidents come in and lead to growth and create basically great opportunities for you to improve and help redefine, or I should say define, your signature sound. And the last thing that you can do on top of all that to really help define your signature sound is to do market analysis. And this is something that I really like because I think it's very important. Now, if you've ever had the opportunity to sit with a top tier touring band in their dressing room after a show, you might find it a very, very interesting conversation. Because what I've seen a lot is like a manager will come in, instead of like everybody's hanging out in the dressing room, we're drilling down the show. They're talking about everything the band did wrong or did right that night, and then after that's done, they sit down with the producer, and they're on the phone. They're talking about the next record, the sound, what's coming in, what's going out, how they're going to, what's going to be the next evolution of their sound. Like they're constantly thinking about how they're positioning themselves. What is their brand? How is their brand going to grow? And how can they get to the next level? If you can start thinking like that as a producer or a mixer, you're going to be an absolute weapon, because most people are not. So what I like to do is I like to sit down and I like to look at the market. So I'll open up Spotify, I'll take out the charts, I'll look at like the top 20, because I mix a lot of rock, and I'll look at like active rock, for example, and I'll just go through and listen to every single thing and after you've been mixing for a while, you can quickly identify, oh, okay, this was done by this person, okay, these are the tools they use, these are the decisions they make, this is where they're strong, this is where they're weak, this is where this mix is strong, this is where this mix is weak, here's the opportunity, here is something they did really, really, really great. If I would have mixed this, I could have came in and tried this, and I think, so when you can sit down and you can analyze the charts and you can look at what your competition's doing, and you can figure out, here's the lineup, right? Like a mugshot lineup. You can look at everybody, what they're doing, what their approach is, and say, where can I fit into that lineup and do something a little bit different, right? So for example, one trend I noticed like 2 years ago, I'm like, everybody I know that mixes pro, most of them are going in the box. And they're doing so solely for convenience, not for sonics. They're doing it because of convenience, because they're like, I can get my fee. There's a high incentive cost bias. I can get my same fee, but I can do, the work faster. And, no one seems to be complaining about the results. So I'm happy. And it's like, you can make more money with less investment. That's a very, 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 very strong argument to get over. Well, I looked at that and I said, okay, that's cool. My artists aren't paying me for convenience. My artists are paying me to get the best possible sonics and the best possible mix. And that's what I care about as a mixer. So if I position myself in a way that I focus my time, energy, and investment on improving my sonics and offering something different and something that, not a lot of people have anymore, that is a position to take in a market. And I look at, like I said, what a lot of my contemporaries are doing. And I said, cool, you're all doing this. I'm going to come over here and do this. And I'm going to do something a little bit different. And so I went, bought a console, bought a bunch of gear, picked a set of gear and a system of gear after much testing and rigorous analysis that fit my ear and my assistants. And we sat down and came up with something we thought was cool. And boom, it helps us create a sound. And now it's positioned and it sounds unique against what everybody else is doing. So when we sit down, I say, okay, if we're taking active rock, for example, I listen to the samples people are using. People are using kicks like this, snares like this. People are using this guitar sim, it sounds like, on their guitars. And you can sit down and you can say, hey, we're going to use kicks like this now and snares like this. Like everybody's using too much 200 and too much transient designer on their snares. So you know what? Let's bring back 80 snares, or let's bring back new metal snares, or let's bring back snares that aren't just a thud and a stick smack, right? Like, let's try to change that a little bit, because now, boom, you've got something fresh that nobody else is doing. You bring some bands to market. If other people start copying it, becomes a trend. Well, all right, cool. So you got to look at it like that. Like, you can calculate your signature sound at a certain point by looking at what other people are doing that you're competing against and figuring out what your approach can be that's a little bit different, that's something new, that when people hear it, they're going to get excited because it's fresh and new. And if you can achieve that, that's dangerous. And you can do really, really, really well with that. So I highly recommend taking the time to do that. That's something you should probably do in your life. I would say like every month. I mean, for me, it's like a weekly thing because I'm mixing. So I'm always listening to the charts and studying them like almost every day. Always taking the last thing that came off my desk, sitting there in my car, going through a Spotify playlist of what's hot right now that this band is competing with. Here's the competition. Here's the types of tools and the formats that they're using. Here's the type of moves they're making, the types of balances, the types of samples they're using or not using. Here's the type of guitar tones they're getting, the type of bass, and I'm trying to position myself against that to where, something either fits or it's a little bit off and fresh, or it's totally fresh and totally new. You know what I mean? Like, there's pros and cons to all of these things. But the point is that you can calculate how you're going to take a band and give them something new that's going to enhance who they are. And it's going to basically take an extension of the skills that you offer as a mixer and personify that into a final product that gets consumed in the marketplace. So I'm going to leave it right there. Hopefully that's some good food for thought for you to think about. You know, a big mission of mine on this channel is to get people to think about actual mixing on a high level and not just like clickbaity stuff, like just throw parallel compression on it. You know what I mean? But to really sit down and think about the philosophies about mixing. Because I know like this stuff is probably boring for a lot of people, but people who are serious, like you understand that this type of stuff I think has more value than just like 5 quick tricks I use to get reverb like a pro. You know what I mean? Like what? So anyways, that's the goal here. Hopefully this stimulates some thought in your brain and helps you get better at this craft. Of course, I'm always doing mixing stuff on TikTok and Instagram. That's at Joel Wanasek. Please give me a like and a comment below if you enjoy this type of content. Subscribe, hit the notification bell. Thank you so much for watching and happy mixing, everybody.